ladies and gentlemen, we're about to move into our next part of the program. With 3 decades of experience in public policy, business, and the law, our next speaker helps leaders and organizations understand, anticipate, and navigate political risks. He was the Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Technology Policy under President George W. Bush, and he has worked as the Senior Leadership Aide in the House of Representatives. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me in welcoming Mr. Bruce Mehlman.
Well, thanks for the brief introduction. We all appreciate that for sure, and appreciate being invited here more as for the opportunity to listen. I mean, wow, Kim, so inspirational in all of the things she's done and her resilience in moving her way up to the C-suite, and Bruce inspiring us about why Terminator is just a movie and technology is powerful. And Leonte, man, that guy, I'm sure everybody else had the same thought. How do we get that guy in front of every American student age 10 to 15? It probably would mess with his day job. So all that inspiration, and they save for last the guy who's here to talk about politics from Washington, D.C., and keeping you between, I'm standing between you and lunch, like I want to punch me in the face. And I like me. I'm going to do my best. I can't, nobody can inspire like Leonte, but I'm going to do my best. When we look at when you think about the U.S. politics today, if the phrase dumpster fire leaps to mind, you're not alone. And I definitely am concerned about where I think we are, but maybe counterintuitively, I'm less concerned about where I think we're going. I think we're ultimately going to get to a healthier place. And I think things like the Southeast Leadership Forum in Georgia are an important part of it. I'm going to explain how I am possibly long-term optimistic, what I think your role is, but I'll start with how we got here. To me, it's a story of where we've been, how that explains where we are, and how we understand where we're going. And when I think about where we are, it's a common mistake in my mind. A lot of people say it's because of one person, or because of COVID, or because of Ukraine. I think we're living in a world that has been undergoing accelerating disruptions, and we haven't yet come to terms with how to deal with them. There are 3 types of trends that I look at for this: technological, geopolitical, and cultural trends. So let's start with technological. If you go back about 4 decades ago, 1984, the Mac came out. Michael Dell starts Dell Computer out of his dorm room. Roughly, that's when the digital revolution began. Everything gets digitized, then networked, then made mobile. This has created amazing opportunities. If you come up with great software, you can reach a customer market of 4 to 5 billion humans instantly. That's unbelievable. Whether you're Georgia Power or any other company, you can leverage technology to be an entrepreneur, to start up faster, to be more cost efficient, to reach more people better. That is amazing. Yet, it's not an equally shared opportunity. Many people point out that concurrent with the digital revolution, we began to see inequality expand in the United States and a lot of developed nations around the world. Those with more skills, more education, more access to capital not only had a lead, but their lead was growing. McKinsey Global Institute says it's a superstar economy. And that led before 2020 to a backlash against the data-dominant players, the Googles, the Amazons, not so much in the stock market, but for a lot of people, regulators, government stakeholders, and others, we weren't their customers, we're their products, and people are upset about that. If you just think about the last 4 years of our lives, technology has upended how we work, live, play, learn, and parent. Of course, we're anxious. But that's not all that was happening. While that was happening, concurrently, the world was changing. We'd been through decades of a Cold War, and then in 1989, the Berlin Wall comes down. Between 1991 and 1994, so a very narrow slice of time, you had all the nations of the former Soviet Union join the global economy. Big reforms bring hundreds of millions of workers in India and China into the global economy. In 1993, the EU was born. In 1994, the World Trade Organization gets launched and NAFTA gets passed. The upshot? Hyperglobalization. Suddenly you can tap global talent, global capital, global markets. If you're running a multinational business, this is amazing. If you run a small business that aspires to be multinational, huge opportunities. But here again, it wasn't an unalloyed good. A lot of Americans you talk to would say, yeah, that's when the factory in my town got moved to China. Or people would say, that's when my assembly work got moved to Mexico. Or that's when my IT job got outsourced to Bangalore. So here again, before 2020 and the pandemic, we were already seeing a backlash. This is the backlash against globalization. It's taken the form of populists running and winning all around the world. Bolsonaro in Brazil, AMLO in Mexico, Modi in India, Boris Johnson and the Brexiteers in the UK, Bernie Sanders, Donald Trump in the United States. Again, super disruptive to go from a fairly steady state Cold War to this hyper-global, who knows what's going on, to clearly some post-Cold War environment. People are feeling stressed out and disrupted, but that's not all, because door number 3, culturally. Go back to 1970. America was overwhelmingly white, Christian, non-college educated. Not that many opportunities for women in the workforce. You had to be extraordinary like Kim to be able to succeed as well as she did. Thanks to accelerating immigration, multiple civil rights movements, we're a far more diverse society today. Instead of 10% of people who got to go to college in 1970, it's up to 37%. It had been 4.7% of the population were immigrants, it's up to 14%. More opportunities for women in the workforce. New voices get heard. We've got a long way to go, but wow, we've come a pretty far way. But one of the voices got lost. The most trusted person in 1970s America wasn't a business leader or a religious leader or a government leader. It was the guy who read the news on TV. Americans would watch at night. There were only 3 networks, so they could try to appeal to the whole nation, and we would watch them with our families. What does Sputnik mean? What should I think about that? What's happening in Vietnam? How should I feel about Watergate? The media sought to inform. The media environment right now is cutthroat competitive. Instead of 3 networks, there is an infinite number of networks. And the media is less likely to inform than they are to affirm. If you're right of center, you're watching Fox News. If you're left of center, you may be watching MSNBC. You're less likely to see the other side as the loyal opposition. And you're more likely to see them as a threat to your way of life. It's harder to have a set of shared facts when you think about policy or politics. And so here again, heading into 2020, we were already amidst the backlash. Those who were left of centers were telling pollsters, why are women still paid less for the exact same work as compared to men? How is there still so much racism evident in how we conduct policing? Right of center voters were telling pollsters, there is so little control on the southern border, I feel like a stranger in my own country. There is so much political correctness, I'm afraid to just have a point of view for fear that I'm going to be canceled. I'm going to lose my job. In an age of disruption, who do you turn to? Well, in the 20th century, you might turn to institutions that were very broad-based, that so many Americans belonged to, that brought people from different backgrounds together. But in the age of the internet, nothing is secret and no one is sacred. And what you find is institutions have lost our trust. The 20th century institutions don't seem to be getting it done. Don't take just these anecdotes for it. Gallup every year does a poll, and they ask about a lot of these institutions. If you go back 1977, 6 of these 10 institutions had a great deal or quite a lot of trust, the highest level, by 50% or more of Americans. Today, only the military is over 50%. Hell, the only military is over 40%, and only the military and church is over 30%. So what do you think happens to our politics in an era of accelerating disruptions where we just don't think the institutions have our back? The answer is disruption arrives in politics. So America, as you guys know, we got a federal election every 2 years. That means there are 10 between 1960 and 1978. If you're upset, what do? You vote for change. So how many change elections did we have in the 60s and the 70s? 3 out of 10. Fast forward the 80s and the 90s. In those 2 decades, how many of those 10 elections were change elections? 4. This century, we've had 12 federal elections in the United States. How many have been change elections this century? 10. Almost every one. If your theory is Donald Trump, he's the reason for all this. He arrived in 2016. I would argue if we're talking about the dumpster fire, he's the bucket of gasoline. He's an accelerant. But The trends that were driving us feeling stressed and disrupted, they pre-existed. My macro theory of why everybody feels so stressed out, why we're voting for change, is when people look around, whether it's in Southeast Georgia or elsewhere across the country, at the policies and the parties and the institutions that govern our lives, they were created in the 20th century for the 20th century. For a lot of Americans, they're not relevant to the 21st century challenges that we face in our lives. We feel fragile. We feel unprotected. So we're looking who can bring hope, who can bring change, who will blow up the establishment. That's what people are voting for. That's where we've been. So how do these trends influence us today? And again, I'll look again, technological, geopolitical, and cultural. Technologically, one of the first observations, that we have is that digital proficiency is defining winners. So what do I mean? We'll start with stock market, just something simple. Who's winning? Information technology companies were 3 of the 10 most valuable companies 1 decade ago. Today, they're 7 of the 10 most valuable companies. Only Saudi Aramco and Berkshire Hathaway, and I think they're kind of rigged because they, for various reasons, they're not your normal company. Eli Lilly, which has gotten onto those GLP-1 weight loss drugs, has managed to crack the top 10. But if you want to be successful, and Bruce is still here, he'll tell you a huge amount of drug discovery now is powered by digital proficiency. The most successful companies are the ones who are leveraging technology to figure this out. Look at politics, the world that I spend more of my time in, for better and worse. Once upon a time, you had to pay your dues. You would show up and you would work your way from local to intermediary to government, yet with the social media technologies, whether it's Trump on the right or Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez on the left, they both mastered the direct-to-consumer way to communicate, and they completely upended, in both cases, established politicians who were seen as rising stars, yet didn't have their power, didn't know how to leverage technology to connect. Look at warfare. If you wonder, the Ukraine-Russia situation, Russia had a massively larger army. It's true we helped Ukraine with resources, but what Ukraine has really leveraged is we're in a new era of warfare. Who's defining the winners? Well, it's who's using drones. It's who's figuring out how to use Starlink satellite for real time. It's who can leverage digital technologies. The digital transformations that I described that defined yesterday are accelerating today. Whatever business you're in, if you don't have a plan to understand and to leverage technology, and especially digital technology, you may have a problem, whether it's medicine or commercial real estate. Geopolitically, again, the trends are reversing, and here I work with a lot of multinational companies, and the multinational companies have loved the people who really profited from and who go to Davos and loved hyperglobalization, they've had decades of tailwinds. It helps them build just-in-time supply chains. So for example, when the Berlin Wall came down is right when we started wiring the world with the internet and then with high-speed internet. If you want to run a global supply chain, you need just-in-time networks connecting information everywhere all of the time, and suddenly you can be a globally integrated business. It was getting easier. Labor. Just as those reforms brought hundreds of millions of workers in India and China who were all really young and really low cost online, suddenly navigation of the seas got easier, and businesses were being pushed by bankers, by consultants, by others. Leverage the world as your factory. After the Cold War ended and the World Trade Organization is launched, there was a multi-decade effort to make it easier to trade, to bring down the cost, so with the World Trade Organization, to bring down tariffs, to bring down barriers. Climate was mostly ignored. The last decade in the EU, they stopped ignoring it and they started regulating towards it. But for the most part, around the world, climate has been ignored. Security. We were in an era of demilitarizing. The so-called peace dividend after the Cold War ended meant people invested less in less tradable defense assets and more in things that they could sell around the world and integrate around the world. The US and China, when China joined the World Trade Organization, the idea was they'd become more like us. They'd become more liberal. They would protect intellectual property better. They would deal with human rights better. That was 3 decades that drove globalization. Every one of these arrows over the next decade is reversing. regardless of who wins the presidential election that I will talk about in a moment, regardless of whether, while I'm talking, Vladimir Putin, God willing, has apologized and left Ukraine, all of these are reversing. Here's how. First, we've wired the world. The macro trend in technology now is regulation. People are scared to death. They didn't hear from Bruce, so they're scared to death of AI. Although programming bees, not cool. That scared me a lot. But whether it's the EU or California or other nations around the world, it will be more challenging going forward to have data flow across borders in the name of consumer protection or national security. The labor trend of outsourcing, China's gotten more expensive. They've gotten older. We're worried about geopolitical risks. But going forward, we're going to see more automation. Factories will have higher output and fewer humans. And so a labor price differential is no longer a reason to build it in Malaysia versus Missouri. You may want to build it closer to your customers. The era when trade barriers were going down has ended. We're now seeing first a global subsidy arms race. What President Biden did in passing the Inflation Reduction Act meaningfully accelerates the energy transition. So it's really good if you're worried about climate change. But starting with Europe, every other country says, well, the company was going to build a battery factory in our country, and now they're moving it to the United States because you guys have all those subsidies, and you have all that Buy America, Build America. We're going to do the same thing. And so everybody's now competing to see who can subsidize. That then leads to the risk of a lot more factories are being built maybe than you need. So they're gluts. China has a problem. Their real estate is hurting their economy, and they're hoping to export their way out of it. So they've got a ton of EVs, and they want to dump it in Europe. That will kill the German car industry. You think Germany is going to be cool with that? We're going to see tariffs to deal with the gluts. We may see the same thing in the United States with respect to some legacy semiconductors. And other nations like Saudi, India, let alone China, Iran, and others realize they need to be more sanctions-proof in case the West disapproves of their behavior and sanctions them. Just like we realize we're way too dependent on China for PPE, on Taiwan for semiconductors. There are too many risks. Climate is now unignorable, and around the world you're seeing more actions to focus on it. NATO nations realize they've got to spend more because Europe is more dangerous than they appreciated, and the US is less reliable than they hoped in their minds. Japan, Australia, Korea realize hoping the US has their back is not as safe as investing more in their own defense. They live in a tough neighborhood. And finally, the macro recognition is that we're going to decouple with China. The idea that they would become more like us over the last 10 years under China President Xi is not true. They're getting more authoritarian. They're becoming more repressive. And that's leading to a recognition that we need to decouple. Cultural. The big cultural trend today is high anxiety. I explained that people were angry. They're also afraid. Think about the 3 years, 4 years we've all just been through. We saw systems fail. We saw our institutions fail. We saw our leadership fail. We hadn't talked about the risk of nuclear war with Russia for 3 decades. We're talking about it again. Inflation hadn't been as bad as it's been for 4 decades. The Agricultural Department last week came out with data that said the average family's share of their annual income they have to spend on food at home and away, highest last year since 1991. Social anxiety. Things that we all accepted were bedrock, constitutionally protected civil rights, after 5 decades are back to a state-by-state decision. People are stressed out, and they perceive that we're in an era of disorder. And whether it's election deniers or lack of control at the border, so many Americans feel that way that when you look, what this chart shows you is people who believe nation is headed in the right direction and people who believe the nation is headed in the wrong direction. The wrong direction, which is red if you can see it, is the higher one. It's up to 73%, the highest NBC's pollsters have found since going back to the George H.W. Bush administration, since the end of the Cold War. Which brings us, I started with yesterday, I moved to today, I will go to tomorrow, and I promised optimism, and you're wondering, this guy's Harry Houdini if he can come up with optimism. Before that, though, I'll talk about the campaign, and one thing Charles asked, he said, you know, I know your stuff. It's a lot of information. It's a lot of data. It's a lot of politics, maybe just some kind of pop culture. So maybe I'll start with a pop culture, just a question. What's the worst sequel ever made? You know, just think about like movies. When we asked our staff this at one staff lunch, we got a lot of good recommendations. You know, Jaws 2 was bad. Paul Blart 2 was bad, but Paul Blart 1 was bad. So I'm not sure that's it. I personally think the worst sequel ever made is Caddyshack 2. I thought the original movie was so wonderfully unique. The new one, you don't have Rodney Dangerfield, you don't have Bill Murray. But I'm not sure the worst sequel of all time isn't the 2024 re-election that 75% of Americans say, I don't want a rematch. Let's find new people. Let's do something new. It led some of us who spend our time trying to study these things to ask, why are we getting a rematch when literally 75% of Americans say we don't want a rematch? I have a theory. Now, my theory, if to be honest, is not embraced by political professionals, but here's my theory. Maybe both parties are trying to lose. Because if you want to lose, what do? You do three things. First, you pick a nominee who's underwater on favorability. Favorable minus unfavorable for President Biden is -15. For former President Trump, -10. Check. Unpopular nominee. What's the second thing you do if you want to lose? Well, you want to leave people uncertain about whether this person will make it for the next 4 to 5 years. You know, it's a little bit of a cheap shot. I feel a little bad because I pray to God I am in the same physical shape Joe Biden is when I'm his age. The guy's still riding a bike. He's doing a lot of stuff. But in front of a microphone, he comes off really old, and he gets the nervous people in the party looking at the actuarial tables. Of course, he is less likely to be in jail by Election Day, and that's what he's facing. Finally, you highlight the issues where you're weakest with swing voters. And Democrats, fair or unfair, if you ask swing voters, what are your concerns with Democrats? They'd say, well, a lot of people at the border are being dumped into cities that have a high homeless problem. I'm worried about crime, particularly in cities, and I'm worried that maybe the teachers union is being given too much power over K to 12 as compared to parents. So you host your convention in Chicago? Like those are the political salient issues in Chicago. But Republicans, it's as if they're innumerate. 2/3 of America says we think Roe v. Wade had the balance right, and 1/3 of Americans say we think Dobbs had the balance right. And Republicans keep thinking that this is going to be the issue to ride in on, and they keep losing on this question, whether it's in the red states of Montana or Ohio or Kansas. I actually don't think they're both trying to lose. I think they're both kind of stuck on a little bit of an autopilot. What I do know about the election, we can be sure of two things. First, it will be close. The margin that stopped Hillary Clinton from becoming president, she won the popular vote, of course, by more than 3%, but the Electoral College she lost, and if you moved 79,316 votes in 3 states, she won the Electoral College also. It's an even smaller margin if you want to have the Electoral College of 2020 end in a tie, in which case Donald Trump would have effectively been reelected. That's scary, and if it's a rematch, there's every reason to believe it's going to be super close in the Electoral College again. It's also a pretty safe and scary bet that half the nation is going to reject the results. 1/3 of Clinton voters said, we don't think Trump was legitimate. 2/3 of Trump voters said, we don't think Joe Biden was legitimately elected. I would note, my background notwithstanding, he was clearly legitimately elected. We've never investigated an election more thoroughly. And yet, when this one's done, whether people blame Bruce and artificial intelligence or blame something else, they're going to have a reason why they're not ready to move forward and why it's going to be a very stressful 2020s. My optimism is in the 2030s, I would note. Now, I don't want to suggest that there aren't opportunities. I mean, isn't that nice? Every time I look at that, it makes me know these guys are best friends in the villages in Florida, and they're cooking and sewing. My point in bringing this up is not to suggest that, unbeknownst to all of you, that Joe Biden and Donald Trump are best friends. They're not. It's that we're in a zero-trust election, and you got to watch out for deepfakes, because it may not be the Terminator and that we worry about, but the ability to have video and audio particularly, and pictures that sure look real, that aren't real, have never been higher. We're being told you can't believe what you see. If it's a close election, we will not know the results the next day. They just have, first of all, you got to count all the votes. They're absentee votes, they're votes by mail, they're military absentees. It takes a little bit of time. If it's close, they're going to have recounts. That's the due process. They're going to go through it. So we're going to potentially be in a period of stress for a while. Foreign nations, we know for a fact, have and will continue to try to, it's less, they don't change the votes, but they make Americans more likely to be mistrustful of one another and angry at one another. Anybody here see the TV show Succession, the last season? I'm worried about life imitating art, because God forbid there is violence at a polling place on election day or near election day, and then you can't know what happened. And that's, it's higher risk than at any point in my lifetime, which has me scared. To me, though, the biggest worry is we're in this crazy world of no trusted referees. Republicans don't trust the mainstream media. Democrats don't trust Fox. Democrats don't trust the Supreme Court. Republicans don't trust the FBI. If this is close, at the end of the day, it's like a sporting event. There's going to be calls. The calls are going to be made. We have people whose job it is to do their best and to make those calls, and we have to accept it and move on. I worry as a business owner, I worry in the community that in the short term, we're facing really high risks. So how am I possibly optimistic? I find whenever I get really, really, really depressed, which is often, about the state of politics, the key for me, the way I get myself out of it is I love reading history. And the old Churchill line, the further back you look, the further forward you can see, rings so true. When I think of not that long, right around when I was born, there is no issue that divides America today as much as the Vietnam War divided us back in 1968. By the way, that was also a year when a global pandemic, not thankfully as bad as COVID, but that was happening, and they tried to muscle through it. As horrible as the murder of George Floyd and the violence that ensued after that and the protests that happened after that, that is nothing compared to the murder of Dr. King and Bobby Kennedy. Cities were burning down. This Chicago convention for the Democrats will be what it'll be, but it ain't going to be fire hoses and all of the stuff you saw in 1968. And we began, the economy right now is actually really healthy, they say. But in the early 60s, we were facing stagflation. So it's not just that it was worse. Remember what happened after 1968? We landed on the moon. This was not just a national shot in the arm, because things stayed bad into the 70s for a while, but this is when the semiconductor industry really got launched, material science innovations happened. When I think about where we are seeing an industrial revolution, the fourth industrial revolution, accelerate. What Bruce told us about AI is overwhelmingly true. I buy all of your positive stuff, 1,000%. I'm a little bit more scared about the downside than you are. But to me, what that means is that we're looking at a future with faster innovation, higher productivity, healthier living, more empowered people. It also means we're going to have to figure out rules of the road, leaving whether it's AI or tech, just figuring out, let them move fast and break things and they'll figure it out. That's not a viable solution. We're going to have to figure out the right policies, but the tech trend is accelerating innovation. Geopolitical, we're back to the great power rivalry. This is not a Trump thing. Biden administration continued to try to de-risk America's position vis-a-vis China, and I see this happening throughout the decade. I pray to God we don't actually go to shooting war, but it sure feels like Cold War II. But maybe it's time to rethink some of the foundations of the global order we've got. Let's remake multilateralism, because when you think about the United Nations, the UN Security Council, the permanent members are Russia, China, and the goal is to prevent war. Like, that doesn't seem very purpose-built for the reality that I'm facing right now. NATO has its mission, but what's the right multilateral approach to deal with climate, or deal with data, or deal with AI? We've got to reimagine. It's a good opportunity to reimagine. I noted that cross-border data flows are slowing down, and America's overall GDP will benefit less from trade, which helps at a macro level, even though it's often punishing to communities. But maybe this creates opportunities for more nation building at home. Maybe this creates opportunities to, instead of shaving off 0.1%, Let me invest more in the factory. Let me invest more in the community in Southeast Georgia to think about how can we be more successful right here at home in the community that gave birth to us and that we want to see successful. Finally, the economics of trade are not wrong. David Ricardo, Adam Smith, they got it right the first time. It's not changed, but comparative advantage doesn't, if you're building it with 3D printers in automated factories, you don't import it, you build it near the customers. And industrial policies can have challenges, but they can also enable renaissances. The culture tomorrow, again, I'm a history nut. I think about where we are, and I've described it in the beginning. Historically high levels of inequality, a big debate. Is immigration our secret sauce that makes us more powerful than ever, or incredibly dangerous for the culture? Are the technologies that are changing how we work, live, play, and learn, which are accelerating, are they good or bad? The top 0.01% seem to have undue power over our politics. And we seem stuck in red state and blue states, like election after election. It feels really gridlocky. Now, you may think, hey, something's wrong with your PowerPoint. It's not. That's the Electoral College map from 1888. Go back and read Doris Kearns Goodwin's Bully Pulpit or any book about America in the Gilded Age. That's America in the Gilded Age. Literally, the last time inequality was as high as it is today, the Gilded Age. The Gilded Age technologies, the last time immigration, 14% now, was as high as this, the Gilded Age. Back then, they had electricity, they had automobiles, they had telegraph, telephony, airplanes. It's pretty serious stuff. The reason I'm optimistic in the medium and the long term is because history tells me that America, as Churchill used to say or said, always does the right thing after trying everything else first. We figured our way out of that. So to deal with the Carnegies, or the Bezos and the Google guys of their day, they invented antitrust law. It was invented 1895 and 1914. There was worker safety laws and food safety laws. To deal with inequality, they amended the Constitution for the progressive income tax. There were political reforms. Women didn't have a constitutional right to vote until 1920. Direct election of senators was seen as a way to give more power to the people. There were social reforms. At the start of the 20th century, there were communities, it wasn't Southeast Georgia in this case, it was in the Northeast first and in the Midwest, where business leaders in forums just like this observed, there is this dawning 20th century industrial revolution, but the kids coming out of school, they're done in 8th grade, and they don't have any of the skills that we need if we want America's factories to lead the world. They should go to school for 9th through 12th grade, learning the skills relevant for this new industrial era and paid for by taxpayers. The opponents at the time said, oh my God, that's socialism. Today we call it high school. Not only did it not kill capitalism, it made sure that capitalism and America's capitalist economy could be the arsenal of democracy that defeated fascism, and we could outcompete communism in the latter half of the 20th century. Where I think we are culturally is we are in that painful, messy process of bringing the policies and the parties and the institutions of last century, the 20th century, into the realities of the 21st. We're in a new reform era. They're always messy, and they always take time. But we can't have a McKinsey Institute superstar economy. That's inadequate. We need to figure out how do we widen the winner circle. We need to reimagine regulation. We desperately don't want to regulate our way to be like Europe and not have AI led here, but we can't just pretend there are no risks and don't worry about it, it'll all work out well. Socially, the design of our entitlement systems can't meet the demographics that we've got, and we need to improve our resilience, whether it's against pandemics or cyber risk or climate. There's a whole lot of political reforms that I think we need to have, but I'll leave you with two thoughts. One thing I know is the greatest reforms in American history are not somebody in Washington figuring it out and imposing it on everybody. They always start in local communities. When Charles was talking to me about the forum, what I thought is so great that you guys do it is Southeast Georgia can and should be the kind of place that figures a lot of these things out. Not necessarily the big, we're not looking to you guys to figure out how to regulate AI, but you may find in how AI is influencing education or how AI is influencing business that you're on to great things. And America's at its best when states and localities and regular citizen leaders figure stuff out and pay attention to what other communities have figured out, and we replicate it. Washington is usually the last mover. Finally, last slide, we also need to mind our perspective. And while I am a huge fan of the Fourth Estate, Charles, we also have to remember the media is in a really competitive business, and as a result, they have every incentive to highlight scary stuff that you're going to watch, you're going to read, you're going to click on, things that make you outraged. The old line, if it bleeds, it leads. That's the media's business. But it's not necessarily always the biggest things happening in the world. And I try to remind myself this because the news is so scary. So here's a couple of just small examples. In 1994, the biggest news story was that Newt Gingrich and the Republican revolutionaries took over Congress. But what shaped the country, Gingrich somewhere down the road here, what shaped the country more? That or the fact that e-commerce was born? The Mosaic browser, the world's first web browser, was launched that same year by Mark Andreessen. I'd argue that has now shaped the world even more. In 2001, the biggest news story was, of course, the 9/11 terrorist attacks. It should have been. What has more influence on 2025? 9/11 and its incredible aftermath, or the fact that in 2001, China joined the World Trade Organization? That hypercharged their rise to now be the new factory floor. They are to manufacturing what were half a century ago. They're a near-peer competitor in technology. They're rising quickly in defense. In 2007, we were focused on the mortgage foreclosure crisis. That's the year the iPhone came out. I believe at the time my quote was, "You can take my BlackBerry from my cold, dead hand." I love that keyboard. I was never going to give that up. I missed that. But oh my God, that enabled social media, that enabled mobile, that has changed the world. We're all stressed out. The pandemic news was bad. In some ways, a lot of that news kind of continues, and especially because it was followed by Ukraine and so many other things. What are we missing? I'm highly confident that there are things out there, and I tend to think, particularly Bruce, early in his presentation, what's happening in medicine, we are in this crazy, unbelievable, amazing renaissance. The fastest vaccine in human history had taken 4 years. They averaged 10. mRNA vaccines were done in less than a year. And while there are some downsides for some people, they were overwhelmingly safe, effective, and saved millions of lives. CRISPR, the CRISPR technology, and also in 2020, was used in humans, proven effective, and now sickle cell anemia doesn't have a treatment, it has a cure. That's unbelievable. ChatGPT-3, which, it's one of the lines that I think you use, but I always hear about AI that always blows me away, is the AI we're living with in our lives is literally the worst AI we're going to have for the rest of our lives, because it's only going to keep getting more powerful and better. And it's already pretty scary. But it leads me ultimately to feel like, both as a nation and as a world, our best days are ahead of us. We go through these periods from time to time when there is the misalignment between the rules and the systems and the policies, and we need these every 60, 80 years. We need reforms. They're never easy. Everybody wants to protect what they've got. It takes the biggest challenge is it takes listening to each other. It takes the fact that you're not always right and you're not always wrong, and until we work together, that's going to be challenging. It feels unexpertly, unscientifically, like it's 1 to 5 years more of this feels bad kind of strife before we start seeing the right sort of leadership bringing us together more often. But I do know this, it starts in places like the Southeast Georgia Leadership Forum. I appreciate your having me, Charles. I'm happy to stay until I go to the airport and hit my flight. Thank you.
Bruce, thank you. We've got about 7 minutes for questions. Any questions? Oh, right off the gate. Sorry.
Thank you. I have a question about the possibility, or the realistic possibility, of us getting away with the Electoral College, doing away with it and going back to a popular vote. And if so, how do we make that happen? Is it going to have to come from the us, or does that Washington even consider it?
I don't think it's going to happen. It would require an amendment to the Constitution that would require the states that are smaller that would lose out from that to willingly cede power. I just don't think they're going to do that. So in the same way, why does California have 2 senators and Wyoming have 2 senators when California has 50-some million people and Wyoming has like 1 million? I think those are baked in, and I'm hard pressed. Logically, if you wanted to get rid of the Electoral College, the small states would have to have a get that they think doesn't dilute their power, and I can't come up with one.
Hi, thank you. So I lived in China for 6 years, and my master's is in Asian Studies, China politics and security. So my question is, there's a and I've done the think tank thing, and so there's a hyper focus on U.S.-China relations, but you mentioned in all these kind of big things that we hyper focus on, is there another area that we're missing? And so I'm wondering, with this hyper focus on U.S.-China, and usually misconstrued, is there another geopolitical area that we're actually missing and that we should be focusing on more because it has greater relevancy?
Well, given that question, I think you know the answer to that better than I do. Maybe. I mean, right now, China is the second most powerful economy. A lot of people think it's about to become the most powerful economy. I'd argue they probably have the second most powerful military, and they're scaling that as fast as they possibly can. I think they don't have the same geopolitical ambitions per se that the Soviet Union does, but they want to have a huge impact and reach. So I guess I'd say I don't think it's a mistake that we are all primarily focused on China. That's the number one geopolitical risk. But I think implicit in your question is a great observation that we have a huge risk of over-rotating and focusing so exclusively on China that we miss, whether it's India or Africa. There is a lot of fascinating stuff. That's where all of the future human population growth is really going to happen. And other younger nations, Indonesia, say, and Southeast Asia, I think we run the risk of not being able to walk and chew gum and so focusing on China that we're missing other things. But I don't think the focus on China is misplaced. And for what it's worth, my biggest fear is less that we're focusing so much on China and more we're so distracted on stupid culture war stuff at home that that the core strength of America, which is our diversity and our inclusiveness and our bringing everybody from identity and ideological backgrounds together to solve problems, we kind of lost some of the muscle memory on how to do that, arguably because when the Cold War ended, the existential threat felt like it went away. And while I don't want an existential threat to come back, that seems to sometimes be what, it's what brought people together after the Great Depression. I haven't figured out the hack around needing, the Death Star to clear the planet, but I'd love to figure out a way to help us focus less on small things at home and more on the big things.
Hi there. I just want to say thank you so much for your presentation. It was incredibly interesting. I have a law and public policy background, so super interesting, totally nerded out. But one of the questions...
My kind of people. Perfect.
Right. One of the questions that I have, I think, as a young person living in this environment, sort of this hyper social media environment, is kind of how do you see the Palestinian genocide and war in Israel affecting our future in America, but also globally? And do you think that it's going to play a part in the next 4 to 5 years, especially in how people are going to vote this year in particular?
Sure. Well, first, I love that question. I wish everybody prefaced their question with the same way. And I know I've got up here, if you liked the kind of way too many slides all about policy and politics and how it interacts, you'll love what I publish on that Substack. If you didn't like it, don't sign up because it's a great question. I'll start with the shorter term, and I'm not sure I know necessarily the longer term answer. On the shorter term, the Gaza-Hamas-Israel situation creates electoral risk for President Biden. President Biden came out vociferously in support of Israel after the terrorist attack of October 7th, but has stayed there despite several months of Israel trying to go do what we tried to do in Afghanistan after 9/11, but not in the same environment, in an environment with lots of people who are in harm's way and therefore far higher civilian casualties. We're going to see, today's Tuesday, right? Yeah, Tuesday. We're going to see today in the Michigan primary. And I think the story we're going to read tomorrow is a shockingly large number of primary Democratic voters voted, I think it's uncommitted, maybe the phrase they have, but and that will be read as a warning that President Biden, in being with Israel on this, is at risk of offending and upsetting particularly younger voters and younger voters of color, and especially Arab American, Muslim American voters who are disproportionately well represented in Detroit and in Michigan. The Dems are trying to figure out, I think that's one reason the president and the administration decided, this seems weird, but decided to pause the export of LNG. One of the reasons is they thought that was a sop to climate issues, which are also of importance to younger voters and more progressive voters. And likewise, the effort to cancel as much student debt as possible. They're trying to balance. I have sympathy for the current president and everybody who's ever held that office. It's a hard job, and all of this is trade-offs. I don't know that I think, the Middle East has been bless you, a geopolitical challenge and a rough neighborhood and an ugly environment for so many innocent people for so many decades. I don't know that I would think that determines America's, the issues that we're dealing with. I think if there's peace tomorrow, let's say some beautiful two-state solution, everybody's okay, and even if that fantasy solution's there, it doesn't fix the problems here at home. And if we can fix the problems here at home, it doesn't necessarily fix the problems there. I wish I were somebody here, probably like my friend who's a China expert, is a Mideast scholar, and maybe they know what to do. I don't know what to do, but I do think it has an electoral risk this year.
Bruce, thank you very much.
Thanks.